Europe in 1595, a 16th century map of Europe by cartographer Abraham Ortelius. The story of Europe, however, begins long before such maps or written records. In this narrative journey, we will travel from Europe's prehistoric origins through antiquity, the medieval era, early modern upheavals, world wars, and into the 21st century. Along the way, we'll encounter the rise and fall of empires, the clash of armies and ideas, and the social and scientific transformations that have shaped the continent. Our focus is broad. Every major development that left a lasting impact on European history and growth will be explored, from the first human footsteps on its soil to the formation of the European Union and contemporary challenges. Settle in for a sweeping chronicle of Europe's entire history, presented in a narrative, conversational style that remains deeply informative. Let's begin at the very beginning, before Europe was even a concept, to understand the context from which European civilization arose. Europe's earliest story predates the existence of any nations, empires, or even written language. It begins with geology and the arrival of the first humans. The continent of Europe, forming the western part of the Eurasian landmass, is traditionally said to take its name from the Greek myth of Europa, a Phoenician princess abducted by Zeus. Long before myths or maps, however, hominins, early human ancestors, trekked into Europe. Fossil evidence shows that Homo erectus had reached Europe roughly 1.8 million years ago, and by around 45,000 BC, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, were present on the continent. These early humans coexisted for millennia with other human species like the Neanderthals, who inhabited Europe during the Ice Age. The Neanderthals eventually vanished 40,000 BC, likely due to competition and interbreeding with modern humans. The last Neanderthal populations retreated to southern Iberia around 35,000 BC. This marked the dawn of Paleolithic Europe, an era of hunter-gatherers facing Ice Age climates and creating the first artworks. In France and Spain, for example, prehistoric people painted magnificent cave art, such as at Chauvet and Lascaux, as early as 30,000 to 20,000 BC, providing a glimpse into the creativity and spiritual life of our earliest European ancestors. As the Ice Age ended, 10,000 BC, and glaciers receded, Europe's climate warmed and human lifestyles began to change. In the Mesolithic period, post-Ice Age hunter-gatherers, people adapted to new environments. But the most profound shift came with the Neolithic Revolution, the introduction of agriculture. Farming first arrived in southeastern Europe, the Balkans, around 700 BC, carried by migrants or ideas spreading from the Fertile Crescent, modern Middle East. Over the next millennia, agriculture spread gradually northward and westward. By about 5000 BC, permanent farming villages dotted Central Europe, and by 400 BC agriculture had reached as far as the Atlantic and northern Europe. This transition from nomadic hunting to settled farming led to population growth and the first towns. It also brought cultural innovations. People domesticated animals, cultivated wheat, barley, and vines, made pottery, and built megalithic monuments. One famous example of late Neolithic Europe is Stonehenge in England, begun around 3000 BC. Genetic and archaeological evidence indicates that modern Europeans stem from a mix of lineages formed in this era: indigenous hunter-gatherers, Near Eastern farmers, and pastoral nomads from the Eurasian steppes. Those steppe nomads, often identified with the Indo-Europeans, began migrating into Europe around 4200 to 3000 BC, bringing new languages and technologies like early metalworking. By the end of the Neolithic period, copper and gold were being worked in the Balkans, ushering Europe into the Chalcolithic Copper Age, a prelude to the Age of Metals. Bronze Age and Iron Age. Early civilizations and cultural migrations. The Bronze Age, roughly 3000 to 1200 BC in much of Europe, saw the rise of regional cultures and long-distance trade. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, enabled stronger tools and weapons, which in turn influenced social hierarchies and warfare. In Southeast Europe and the Aegean, this era witnessed Europe's first civilizations in the full sense: the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, circa 3000 to 1100 BC, and later, the Mycenaean civilization on mainland Greece, circa 1600 to 1100 BC. The Minoans are often considered Europe's first advanced society, known for their palace complexes like Knossos, vibrant art, and early writing system, Linear A. They carried out active trade across the Mediterranean, connecting Europe to Egypt and the Near East. After about 1450 BC, the Mycenaeans, likely the Greeks of Homeric legend, came to dominate Crete and inherited much of the Minoan culture. On the mainland, Mycenaean Greeks built fortified citadels, and left behind linear B tablets, the earliest written Greek. These Bronze Age Greeks would later be remembered in epic tales like the Trojan War, reflecting a world of warrior kings and heroes. Elsewhere in Bronze Age Europe, there were no written records, but archaeology reveals a tapestry of cultures. In Central and Western Europe, communities like the Bell Beaker culture circa 2800 to 1900 BC, and others engaged in metalwork and widespread exchange of goods. The Celtic peoples began to emerge towards the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. The Iron Age in Europe, roughly 1200 BC onward, though starting later in the far north, brought even stronger iron tools and weapons, facilitating both agriculture and warfare. Around 1200 to 800 BC, the collapse of Bronze Age palace societies in the Aegean, possibly due to invasions or internal strife, led to a Greek Dark Age, but elsewhere new powers arose. In Italy, small Latin and Etruscan city-states were forming. Across Central Europe, the Hallstatt culture, c. 1200 to 500 BC, and later the Latine culture, c. 500 to 50 BC, are associated with the spread of the Celts. Celts were not a single kingdom, but a collection of tribes sharing language and art styles, inhabiting areas from modern Spain and France to Britain and Central Europe. They even migrated into Asia Minor, Galatia, and sacked Rome in 390 BC. By the Classical Age, circa 5th century BC, Celtic tribes and other Iron Age peoples, Germans, Iberians, Illyrians, etc., dominated much of Europe north of the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, a very different kind of society was flourishing in the sunny isles and peninsulas of the Mediterranean, one that would lay the cornerstones of Western civilization. By around 800 BC, after the Bronze Age upheavals, ancient Greece was entering its vibrant archaic period. Dozens of independent city-states or polis emerge across Greece and the Aegean, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and many more. The period from roughly 800 BC to 500 AD is traditionally called Classical Antiquity, and it begins with the Greeks. Greek city-states experimented with different forms of governance, ranging from Spartan monarchy/oligarchy to Athenian democracy, where citizens could vote on laws. In 507 BC, Athens instituted reforms that are often cited as the first democratic system. The Greeks also colonized widely, founding settlements around the Mediterranean and Black Sea, from Marseille in France to Byzantium and Crimea, spreading Hellenic culture far and wide. The 5th century BC marks the golden age of Greece, especially in Athens under leaders like Pericles. During this time, the Greeks repelled an invasion by the mighty Persian Empire, the Persian Wars, 490 to 479 BC, and then Athens and Sparta turned on each other in the destructive Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BC. Greek culture, however, thrived. Philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle asked fundamental questions about ethics, knowledge, and governance, laying the foundations of Western philosophy. Dramatic poets like Sophocles and Euripides wrote tragedies that are still performed today. Greeks pioneered the study of history, Herodotus, Thucydides, and science, e.g. Pythagoras in math, Hippocrates in medicine. We have the ancient Greeks to thank for ideas and institutions that persist even now: democracy, libraries, the Western alphabet, geometry, the Olympics, and more. In art and architecture, the Greeks sought ideal beauty and balance. The Parthenon Temple in Athens, built in the 5th century BC, remains an iconic symbol of classical architecture. Greek city-states also worshipped a common pantheon of gods like Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and shared cultural festivals. Despite their internal rivalries, they saw themselves as one people. Hellenes in contrast to barbarians abroad. In the 4th century BC, Macedonia, a kingdom to the north, rose to prominence under King Philip II and his son Alexander the Great. Alexander, tutored by Aristotle, inherited the Macedonian throne in 336 BC and proceeded to conquer the vast Persian Empire, marching his armies all the way to Egypt and India. In little over a decade, Alexander created one of the largest empires of the ancient world and spread Greek language and culture across 3 continents. Though Alexander died young in 323 BC and his empire fragmented, the result was the Hellenistic Age. Greek influence meshed with Egyptian, Persian, and other cultures, giving rise to cosmopolitan centers like Alexandria and Egypt. The Greek legacy in Europe endured. The language of Greek became a lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, and Greek ideas in science, philosophy, and art would later be absorbed by another rising power in the West, Rome. On the Italian peninsula, the city of Rome was traditionally founded in 753 BC. Legend says by Romulus, after he and his twin Remus were raised by a she-wolf. Whatever its true origins, Rome grew from a small kingdom under Etruscan influence into a republic around 509 BC, when the Romans expelled their kings and established a Roman republic governed by the Senate and elected magistrates. The republic expanded aggressively. By 265 BC, Rome had unified Italy under its control, and soon it collided with Carthage, a powerful Phoenician colony in North Africa in the Punic Wars. Rome's victory in the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC, against the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal, left it the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. Over the next century, Rome also conquered Greece and much of the Eastern Mediterranean. By 100 BC, the Roman Republic controlled Spain, North Africa, Greece, and parts of Anatolia, with influence spreading via alliances and wars. This expansion, however, brought strains. The 1st century BC saw civil wars and the end of the Republic. Famous figures like Julius Caesar, who conquered Gaul 58 to 50 BC, and even ventured to Britain, played a pivotal role. Caesar's rise to power led to his assassination in 44 BC by senators fearing his dictatorial control. After another round of civil wars, Caesar's grandnephew Octavian emerged as victor and was given the title Augustus in 27 BC, effectively becoming the first Roman emperor. Thus began the Roman Empire in the West. Under Augustus and the early emperors, the empire entered a period of relative peace and prosperity known as the Pax Romana, Roman peace. At its height, 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire spanned the entire Mediterranean basin and much of Europe, from Britain and Portugal in the west to the Middle East and North Africa in the east and south, and up to the Rhine and Danube frontiers in the north. Roman rule brought roads, cities, laws, and a shared cultural framework to these diverse territories. The Romans were master builders, erecting aqueducts, amphitheaters like the Colosseum, AD 80, temples, and forums whose ruins stilled Europe. Latin, the language of Rome, spread across Western Europe. In time, it would evolve into the Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, etc., spoken by hundreds of millions today. Roman law and governance also left a deep mark. The Roman legal tradition, codified in documents like the 12 Tables and later Justinian's Code, is a foundation of many modern legal systems. Concepts such as republic, senate, and even the idea of a balanced government with checks and balances trace back to Roman ideals. Culturally, Roman religion adopted and reinterpreted Greek gods. Roman art and literature, writers like Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, blended influences but achieved their own lasting classics. One of the most profound changes in the late Roman Empire was the rise of Christianity. Born in the eastern province of Judea under Roman rule, the Christian faith spread gradually, often in the face of persecution. In AD 312, Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and soon after, 313, issued the Edict of Milan granting religious tolerance. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, setting the stage for Europe's religious landscape for the next 1,500 years. Despite its strength, the Roman Empire in the West eventually weakened under internal turmoil, economic trouble, and external pressures. Barbarian migrations and invasions were a major factor. Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, Lombards, Franks, and others moved into Roman territories, driven partly by the expansion of the Huns from Central Asia, led by Attila in the 5th century. In AD 376, Goths crossed the Danube seeking refuge. In 410, the Visigoths even sacked Rome. The traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is AD 476, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. By then, Roman rule had disintegrated in Britain, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, replaced by a patchwork of successor kingdoms. However, it's important to note the Eastern Roman Empire, known later as the Byzantine Empire, survived and continued for another 1,000 years out of Constantinople. The idea of Rome's legacy lived on as well. Many of those Germanic kings sought to preserve aspects of Roman administration, law, and culture. The legacy of Rome is indeed vast. In government, law, language, architecture, engineering, and religion, Roman influence still endures. Europe, as we know, cannot be imagined without the dual heritage of Greece and Rome. With Western Rome's collapse, Europe entered a new era traditionally called the Middle Ages, or medieval period, roughly 5th to 15th century. This was a time of fragmentation and transition, but also one that laid the groundwork for the nations and cultures of modern Europe. The early Middle Ages, sometimes dubbed the Dark Ages for its scarcity of records and perceived cultural decline, witnessed population decreases, especially in urban centers, and a reversion to more localized rule. Classical learning dimmed in Western Europe, preserved mainly in monasteries, while the Catholic Church emerged as a unifying institution across former Roman lands. By around 8500, Christianity had not only survived but become the spiritual bedrock of Europe. The Catholic Church held tremendous sway over medieval European society, providing continuity and literacy as clergy were often the only literate class. After 476, Germanic kingdoms took the stage in the West. In Italy, the Ostrogoths ruled, then the Lombards. In Spain, the Visigoths. In North Africa, the Vandals, briefly. And in Gaul, France, the Franks, a people who would rise to great prominence. In 800 AD, the Frankish king Charlemagne, Charles the Great, was crowned emperor of the Romans by the Pope, reviving the idea of a Western Roman Empire in the form of the Frankish Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne's empire covered much of France, Germany, Italy, and more, and he fostered a revival of learning, the Carolingian Renaissance. Though his empire split among his grandsons, Treaty of Verdun, 843, it laid the foundations for the Kingdom of France, West Francia, and the Holy Roman Empire, East Francia/Germany, in later centuries. Meanwhile, in the British Isles, post-Roman Anglo-Saxon kingdoms formed in England, even as Celtic realms persisted in Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Across the North Sea, Scandinavians had largely remained pagan and outside the Roman world, but that would change violently with the onset of the Viking Age. Starting in the late 8th century, 793 AD with the raid on Lindisfarne, seafaring Vikings from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden began raiding and later settling in wide areas, from the British Isles and France, where Normans descend from Vikings, to Russia, the Rus, even reaching Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America. This second great migration of Norse peoples reshaped parts of Europe, contributed to the collapse of weak kingdoms, but also led to new state formations, e.g. the Duchy of Normandy. During the early medieval period, a new power and religion also arrived from the south, Islam. After the Prophet Muhammad's era, Islamic caliphates expanded rapidly across the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th to 8th centuries. In 711 AD, Muslim forces, mainly Arabs and Berbers, crossed into Hispania, Spain, defeating the Visigothic kingdom and establishing Al-Andalus, an Islamic realm in Iberia. Within a decade, Muslim armies pushed into Gaul until halted by Frankish forces, traditionally at the Battle of Tours in 732. For the next several centuries, Christian and Muslim Europe coexisted, often warily. Al-Andalus in Spain flourished as a center of learning and culture, even as northern Spanish Christian kingdoms gradually pushed back the Reconquista. In the east, the Byzantine Empire stood as a bastion of Christianity against Islamic expansion, though it lost territories like Syria, Egypt, and North Africa to the Arab caliphates. The presence of Islamic powers in Europe, in Spain, Sicily, and later the Balkans under the Ottoman Turks will be a significant thread in Europe's story, fostering exchanges in science and philosophy, but also sparking conflict. Society in early medieval Europe was rural and built on a system that would later be called feudalism. Feudalism was a hierarchy of reciprocal obligations. Kings and lords granted land, fiefs, to vassals, nobles, knights, in exchange for military service and loyalty. Those vassals in turn had peasants or serfs working the land. This decentralized structure arose because no central authority was strong enough to provide protection after Rome's fall. Local lords and castles provided security in a violent time. By the 9th to 10th centuries, feudalism and manorialism, the economic system of self-sufficient estates, were entrenched in much of Europe north of the Alps. The Catholic Church also structured society. Bishops and abbots were often major landholders, and the Pope in Rome maintained spiritual leadership. Monasteries spread Christianity to pagan areas, St. Patrick in Ireland, St. Boniface in Germany, Cyril and Methodius among the Slavs, etc., and preserved classical knowledge through scriptoria copying ancient texts. By 1000 AD, virtually all of Europe from Ireland to Western Russia had been converted to Christianity, whether Catholic or, in the Byzantine East, Orthodox. Around the year 1000, Europe showed signs of revival. Improved agricultural techniques, the heavy plow, crop rotation, and a warmer climate led to population growth and the expansion of towns. The period from roughly 1000 to 1300 is the High Middle Ages, marked by rising kingdoms, religious fervor, and cultural flowering. Feudal monarchies grew more organized. For example, England's Norman kings, after 1066, built a strong administrative system, and Capetian kings in France slowly expanded their control. The Holy Roman Empire, a loose German-Italian confederation of territories, vied with the papacy for influence. This era also saw the emergence of early nation consciousness. The names England, France, Spain, etc. begin to mean more defined realms. One defining series of events in this era were the Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II called on Western Christians to launch a crusade to reclaim the Holy Land, Jerusalem, from Muslim control. This initiated 2 centuries of intermittent crusading. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, succeeded in capturing Jerusalem and setting up small crusader states. Subsequent crusades were less successful militarily. Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, the Fourth Crusade in 1200 for tragically sacked Christian Constantinople instead, but the crusading movement had profound effects. It intensified religious polarization even as it spurred trade and cultural contact between Europe and the Middle East. Europeans were reintroduced to ancient Greek knowledge preserved by Arab scholars, Aristotle, medicine, mathematics, and acquired new products, spices, silk. The Crusades also emboldened the Church's influence and the ideal of knighthood and chivalry. During the High Middle Ages, the Catholic Church reached the height of its power. The papacy asserted authority over secular rulers in disputes like the investiture controversy over who appoints bishops. Monastic orders, Benedictines, later Franciscans, Dominicans, proliferated. Nearly everyone in Western Europe accepted the spiritual authority of the Church, and fear of excommunication was real even for kings. The Church also sponsored universities. The first universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, etc., arose in the 12th to 13th centuries, where theology, law, medicine, and arts were studied in Latin. Intellectual life blossomed with scholastic philosophers like Thomas Aquinas attempting to reconcile faith and reason, drawing on Aristotle's philosophy newly available in Latin. In architecture, the period saw the construction of magnificent Gothic cathedrals, Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres, Canterbury, etc., engineering marvels of their time with soaring pointed arches and stained glass. Meanwhile, Europe's economy was slowly transforming. The growth of towns and trade created a merchant class and wealthy urban centers, especially in Italy and the Low Countries. Republics like Venice and Genoa thrived on Mediterranean trade, and Hanseatic League cities dominated Baltic commerce. The introduction of new technologies, the windmill, improved ships, the compass from China, and financial innovations, banks' credit, laid the groundwork for a more dynamic economy. By 1300, some European cities like Paris, Milan, and London had populations in the hundreds of thousands, small by modern standards, but signaling urban revival. The late Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500, were a tumultuous time. Prosperity gave way to calamities that shook Europe to its core. One major catastrophe was the Great Famine, 1315 to 1317, caused by crop failures and climate change, which killed millions. Even worse was the Black Death, the bubonic plague pandemic that struck in 1347 to 1351. The plague swept through Europe with horrifying speed, killing an estimated 25 million people, roughly one-third of Europe's population. Entire towns were devastated, and social order was upended as labor became scarce and fear pervasive. This traumatic loss triggered economic and social changes. With fewer serfs, the survivors often demanded wages or mobility, helping to weaken the feudal serfdom system. During the same era, Europe was racked by almost constant warfare. The Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France, was a series of conflicts over claims to the French throne, devastated regions of France. It witnessed the rise of the longbow and gunpowder weapons, and heroes like Joan of Arc who inspired the French to eventual victory. Internally, many regions saw peasant revolts, e.g. the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, fueled by socio-economic stress. The unity of the Church also cracked. In 1378, the Western Schism led to rival popes in Avignon and Rome, weakening the Church's moral authority. Earlier, a series of crusades had been called even within Europe, such as the Northern Crusades against pagan Baltic peoples and campaigns against heretical Christian sects like the Cathars. By 1453, 2 symbolic events marked the end of an era. The French expelled the English to end the Hundred Years' War, and far to the east, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Empire, a rising Muslim power, conquered the Byzantine capital in 1453, effectively ending the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire. This not only altered the balance of power in Eastern Europe, but also is said to have spurred Western Europeans to seek new sea routes to Asia, since the Turks controlled the old Silk Road. Indeed, 1453 is often cited by historians as the end of the Middle Ages, transitioning to the Renaissance era. Despite the turmoil, the late medieval period also sowed seeds of renewal. In northern Italy of the 14th century, city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan were prospering and patronizing arts and scholarship. Thinkers and artists, inspired by the classical past, ignited the Renaissance, a rebirth of learning that emphasized humanism, the value of human beings in the material world, as opposed to purely religious focus. Poets like Dante and Petrarch, artists like Giotto, and scholars of antiquity signaled a cultural awakening. By the 15th century, this Italian Renaissance was in full bloom. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael created masterpieces. Architects like Brunelleschi designed grand domes. Humanist scholars like Erasmus in the North promoted critical study of classical texts and called for reform. Crucially, around 1450, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press in Europe using movable type, revolutionizing the spread of information. Books could now be mass-produced, rapidly disseminating new ideas across the continent, an information revolution akin to today's digital age. In summary, the Middle Ages began with a fractured Europe where survival was paramount, and ended with a Europe poised for global exploration and intellectual transformation. Medieval Europe saw the formation of languages and proto-nations, the entrenchment of Christianity and foundational institutions, universities, parliaments in England and elsewhere, legal traditions. By 1500, Europe was very different from the post-Roman chaos it started in. Population was growing again after the plagues, economies were more vibrant, and a sense of European identity was budding, partly in contrast to the encircling Muslim powers of the Ottomans and Moors. As the 15th century turned to the 16th, Europe entered the early modern period, commonly dated from around 1500. This era is characterized by dramatic changes in thought, religion, politics, and Europe's interaction with the wider world. Technological innovations profoundly altered society. The widespread use of gunpowder weapons, cannons, firearms, transformed warfare, making medieval knights and castles obsolete. The printing press in Europe since Gutenberg, 1450s, transformed knowledge. Ideas, whether scholarly or subversive, could spread rapidly and widely. Navigation advances, improved ships, compasses, astrolabes, enabled long oceanic voyages. Europe was on the verge of expanding beyond its shores, and in 1492, Christopher Columbus's voyage, funded by Spain, reached the Americas, an event that would reshape the world. In the late 15th and 16th centuries, European mariners set out across the world's oceans in what is often called the Age of Discovery. The Portuguese, led by explorers like Vasco da Gama, found a sea route around Africa to India in 1498. The Spanish, with Columbus and later Magellan, whose expeditions circumnavigated the globe by 1522, claimed vast new lands in the Americas. These discoveries led to the establishment of European colonial empires. Spain conquered large parts of the Americas, overthrowing the Aztec and Inca empires, and extracted enormous wealth in silver and gold. Portugal built a trade network from Brazil to Africa, India, and East Asia, Goa, Malacca, Macau. In the 17th century, other powers joined. England, France, and the Netherlands established their own colonies and trading companies, like the British East India Company and Dutch VOC. This colonization brought great riches, spices, precious metals, sugar, furs, to Europe and dramatically altered economies. Western Europe in particular benefited, as colonial exploitation of resources and peoples fueled its rise. However, it also set in motion the tragic Atlantic slave trade and the decimation of indigenous populations abroad. Europe's global power was skyrocketing, setting the stage for it to dominate world affairs in coming centuries. Back home, these new contacts and wealth contributed to growth. New foods, potatoes, maize, tomatoes from the Americas, enriched European diets. Mercantilism became the guiding economic policy. Nations sought to accumulate wealth by trade and colonization. Competition for colonies also spurred conflicts between European powers, Anglo-Spanish wars, etc. Yet the exchange wasn't one way. For example, the Ottoman Empire, which spanned Southeast Europe and the Middle East, was a key player, and Eastern luxury still came via Ottoman or other intermediaries until Europeans could fully take over those trades. Culturally, the Renaissance that began in Italy spread across Europe in the 16th century. Kings and popes became patrons of the arts and sciences. Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa and conceptualized flying machines. Michelangelo sculpted David and painted the Sistine Chapel. Humanist scholars revived interest in Greco-Roman literature and emphasized secular learning alongside religious faith. By the late 1500s and 1600s, this spirit of inquiry led to the scientific revolution. Traditional medieval views of the cosmos, based on Aristotle and Ptolemy, were challenged. In 1543, Copernicus proposed a heliocentric model that Earth orbits the Sun. Later, Galileo Galilei used the telescope to support this theory, while Johannes Kepler described planetary motions with mathematics. Such findings often brought these scientists into conflict with church authorities. Galileo was famously tried by the Inquisition. Nevertheless, the pursuit of knowledge accelerated. Isaac Newton's laws of motion and universal gravitation, 1687, epitomized the scientific revolution, explaining the world through reason and observation. This period also saw advances in medicine, Vesalius's anatomy, Harvey's discovery of blood circulation, and technology, improved clocks, microscopes, etc. The cumulative effect was a profound shift. Rationalism and empirical evidence started to gain prestige over tradition and dogma. While science and art flourished, the unity of Christendom that had characterized medieval Europe shattered in the 16th century. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther famously nailed, or at least issued, his 95 Theses, protesting against abuses in the Catholic Church, notably the sale of indulgences. This act ignited the Protestant Reformation, a religious upheaval that split Western Christianity. Luther's ideas, salvation by faith alone, the authority of Scripture over church hierarchy, spread quickly, thanks in part to the printing press. Many German princes embraced Lutheranism, partly out of conviction and partly to assert independence from the Church and Holy Roman Emperor. Soon, other reformers followed. John Calvin in Geneva advocated a strict moral theology, Calvinism, and Henry VIII in England broke with Rome for both personal and political reasons, leading to the Church of England. By mid-16th century, Europe's religious map was redrawn. Protestant regions in the north, Germany, Scandinavia, Scotland, parts of France and the Netherlands, England after 1534, and Catholic strongholds in the south, Italy, Spain, Austria, Poland, etc. The Reformation sparked a series of religious wars and persecutions. The German Peasants' War, 1524 to 1525, had social as well as religious dimensions. France was torn by the French Wars of Religion, Catholics versus Huguenot Protestants, in the late 1500s, which included the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, 1572. The Dutch Revolt, 1568 to 1648, against Catholic Spanish rule led to an independent Dutch Republic, which was Protestant. Perhaps most devastating was the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, fought primarily in the Holy Roman Empire but drawing in many powers. Ostensibly a Protestant-Catholic conflict, it also involved dynastic politics. France, though Catholic, supported Protestants to undermine Habsburg Austria. The war ravaged Central Europe. Regions of Germany lost a huge portion of their population to violence, famine, and disease. It ended with the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, a treaty of great significance. It allowed rulers to choose their state's religion, Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist, and marked a step toward the concept of state sovereignty in international law, often cited as the beginning of the modern nation-state system. The Catholic Church itself underwent reform in response, the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, clarified Catholic doctrine and addressed some abuses. New religious orders like the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola, emerged, who became influential educators and missionaries, even traveling as far as China and the Americas to spread Catholic Christianity. Europe's religious division, however, was here to stay. It influenced politics, e.g., Catholic Spain versus Protestant England clashed, culminating in the failed Spanish Armada invasion of England in 1588. By the 17th century, the political landscape featured more consolidated nation-states. The idea of the sovereign state took hold after Westphalia. Rulers could no longer easily interfere in others' domestic religious affairs. In practice, this led to the rise of absolutist monarchies in some countries. For example, France under Louis XIV, reigned 1643 to 1715, became the epitome of absolutism with his famous phrase, "L'état, c'est moi the state." He built the opulent Palace of Versailles and revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had granted tolerance to Protestants, asserting tight control over nobility and religion. In Eastern Europe, Peter the Great of Russia, late 1600s, and the Habsburg emperors in Austria also centralized power and modernized their states to compete in European affairs. However, in England, a different path was taken. Conflicts between king and parliament led to the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, the execution of King Charles I, a brief republic under Oliver Cromwell, and eventually the Glorious Revolution of 1688. This established a constitutional monarchy in England with a Bill of Rights, 1689, that limited royal power and affirmed parliamentary supremacy, a critical step in liberal political development. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, great power struggles played out. Wars were frequent but were now often driven as much by dynastic and balance of power concerns as by religion. The wars of Louis XIV, the Great Northern War between Russia and Sweden, the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, and others reshuffled territories among crowns. By mid-18th century, a few major powers dominated Europe: France, Britain, now united as Great Britain after 1707, increasingly a naval and colonial powerhouse, Habsburg Austria, Prussia, a rising military state in Germany, and Russia. The Ottoman Empire still held the Balkans and threatened Vienna as late as 1683, when a massive Ottoman siege of Vienna was famously lifted by a Polish-led force. But thereafter the Ottomans gradually retreated, earning the moniker the sick man of Europe by the 19th century. An important intellectual development of the 18th century was the Enlightenment. Thinkers across Europe, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau in France, Kant in Prussia, Hume in Scotland, and many others, promoted reason, science, and individual rights, often challenging established traditions and authorities. They advocated ideas like freedom of speech, separation of powers in government, religious toleration, and social contracts between rulers and the ruled. Coffee houses and salons became centers of debate. This ferment of ideas laid the groundwork for political revolutions to come, as educated elites and some monarchs, the so-called enlightened despots like Frederick the Great or Catherine the Great, tried to apply rational reforms to society. By 1750 or so, Europe was poised on the brink of both industrial and political revolution. It had become the world's most dynamic continent in terms of exploration, scientific knowledge, and for better or worse, military power. The stage was set for the great transformations of the late 18th and 19th centuries, which would propel Europe to global dominance, and sow the seeds of modern democratic ideals and upheavals. The late 18th and 19th centuries were a time of dramatic upheaval in Europe. Revolutions, political, industrial, and social, fundamentally altered European societies and the balance of world power. This era saw the rise of nationalism, the spread of liberal ideas, the birth of new nations, and the peak and beginnings of decline of European global dominance. In 1789, the center of historical gravity shifted to France. Decades of Enlightenment ideas, combined with social inequality and a financial crisis, led to the outbreak of the French Revolution in July 1789. The storming of the Bastille prison on July 14, 1789, became a symbol of the uprising. The absolute monarchy under Louis XVI was challenged by a revolutionary assembly that issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, proclaiming liberty, equality, and fraternity. Feudal privileges were abolished. In the following years, France became a constitutional monarchy and then, amidst internal and external pressures, a republic. King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in 1793, shocking the crowned heads of Europe. The revolution took a radical turn during the Reign of Terror, 1793 to 1794, when Maximilien Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety executed thousands suspected of counter-revolutionary activities. Eventually, the radical phase subsided, Robespierre fell, and a more moderate Directory government took over. Throughout this period, France was at war with a shifting coalition of European monarchies alarmed by revolutionary ideas: Austria, Prussia, Britain, etc. A young Corsican artillery officer, Napoleon Bonaparte, rose through the ranks thanks to these wars. In 1799, Napoleon seized power in a coup, becoming first consul, and by 1804 he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Napoleon's rule, 1804 to 1815, dramatically changed Europe. He was a reformer, instituting the Napoleonic Code, which reformed laws, emphasizing equality before law, secular authority, property rights, and spreading many revolutionary principles across Europe. But he was also a conqueror. During the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon's Grand Army defeated various European coalitions and redrew the map. By 1812, Napoleon controlled or had allies in most of Western and Central Europe. He abolished the Holy Roman Empire, reshuffled German states into a French-dominated Confederation of the Rhine, installed his brothers as kings in Spain, Naples, Westphalia, etc., and humbled Austria and Prussia. His invasion of Russia in 1812, however, was a turning point. The campaign failed disastrously due to harsh winter and scorched earth tactics, decimating his army. Thereafter, a rejuvenated coalition, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, and others, defeated Napoleon in 1813 to 1814. Napoleon was exiled, made a brief comeback in 1815, the Hundred Days, only to be decisively defeated at Waterloo, June 1815, by the Duke of Wellington and Prussian allies. He spent the rest of his life in exile on St. Helena. The Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, led by statesmen like Austria's Metternich, sought to restore stability and the old order after nearly 25 years of constant revolution and war. The principle was to maintain a balance of power to prevent any single country from dominating, as France had. Europe's map was reset. France was reduced to its pre-war borders, a German confederation, loosely tying 39 states, replaced the HRE, a kingdom of the Netherlands was created, and so on. The concert of Europe, an informal alliance of the great powers, Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, aimed to suppress revolutionary movements and maintain the status quo. Despite this conservative turn, the genie was out of the bottle. Liberal and national ideas had spread and would resurface repeatedly. Even as political revolutions rocked France and beyond, a quieter but ultimately even more transformative revolution was underway in how people worked and lived, the Industrial Revolution. Starting in Britain in the late 18th century, mechanized factories began to spring up, first in the textile industry. The invention of the steam engine, improved by James Watt in the 1770s, provided a new power source that would drive mills, locomotives, and steamships. Coal and iron became the essential raw materials of the age. By the early 19th century, railroads crisscrossed Britain and soon continental Europe, drastically reducing transport times and knitting economies together. Industrialization then spread to Belgium, France, the German states, and beyond, though unevenly. Some regions, like parts of Eastern Europe, remained largely agrarian through much of the 19th century. The social effects of industrialization were immense. A new urban working class proletariat emerged, as masses of people moved from the countryside to work in factories under often harsh conditions, long hours, low pay, unsafe environments. Simultaneously, an industrial and financial middle-class bourgeoisie grew in wealth and influence, championing ideals of free enterprise and often liberal politics. Cities swelled. By 1850, London had over 2 million people, becoming the world's largest city. Industrial centers like Manchester, Essen, and Milan expanded rapidly. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and child labor in these cities eventually led to social reforms and public health measures later in the century. Intellectual responses to industrial capitalism included new ideologies. Socialism arose as a critique of the injustices seen in early industrial society. Thinkers like Karl Marx, a German philosopher who published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, argued that history was a class struggle and envisioned an eventual worker-led revolution to overthrow capitalism. While Marxism took root among some in the working-class intelligentsia, many workers sought more immediate improvements through the formation of trade unions and through political movements advocating expanded suffrage and labor rights. Indeed, demands for broader democracy were growing. Britain, which had a parliament but very restricted voting rights, saw agitation that led to the Reform Acts, expanding the franchise gradually to more men. Most Western European countries in the 19th century slowly moved from aristocratic rule toward more inclusion of the middle class, though universal male suffrage in many places only came late in the century, and female suffrage only in the 20th. The 19th century was the heyday of nationalism, the belief that people who share a common language, culture, and history should form an independent nation. This idea, fueled partly by the French Revolution's notion of the people and partly by Romanticism's celebration of folk cultures, had explosive consequences in multi-ethnic empires and regions divided among many states. In 1848, a wave of revolutions swept Europe. Sparked by a mixture of liberal, nationalist, and socialist sentiments, uprisings erupted in France, the German states, the Austrian Empire, Italy, and elsewhere. In Paris, discontent with the monarchy of Louis Philippe led to its overthrow and the creation of a short-lived Second Republic, which soon gave way to Louis Napoleon's empire. In the German states, liberals convened the Frankfurt Parliament to attempt German unification with a constitutional framework, though this ultimately failed when the Prussian king refused a crown from the gutter. In Vienna, the Austrian Empire, a mosaic of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, and others, nearly unraveled. Hungarian nationalists declared independence, and various subject peoples demanded rights. Austrian Chancellor Metternich resigned and fled, symbolizing the old order's fright. In Italy, which was then a patchwork of states, some under Austrian rule, others independent, 1848 saw revolts in places like Milan, Venice, and Rome, where a Roman Republic briefly ousted the Pope. Yet, by 1849, most of these revolutions had been suppressed by reactionary forces. The monarchs and their armies regained control. 1848 was called the Year of Revolution, but also by conservatives, the Year of Failed Revolutions. However, though immediately unsuccessful, the revolutions planted seeds. Within 2 decades, the map of Europe did change along nationalist lines. The 1850s, 1870s saw the unification of Italy and Germany, two major outcomes of nationalist aspirations. Italy was unified through the efforts of figures like Giuseppe Garibaldi, Giuseppe Mazzini, and the Piedmont Sardinia Prime Minister Count Cavour. Starting from the north, Piedmont, and south, Garibaldi's redshirt volunteers conquering Sicily/Naples, Italian states were merged, and by 1861 the Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed under King Victor Emmanuel II, though full unity waited until 1870 when Rome was seized from the Papal States. Germany's unification was achieved by the Kingdom of Prussia under the leadership of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Through a policy of Blut und Eisen, blood and iron, Bismarck orchestrated 3 wars that galvanized German unity, a short war with Denmark in 1864 gaining territory, the Austro-Prussian War in 1866 expelling Austrian influence from northern Germany, and finally the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 1871. Prussia's victory over France electrified the German states. In 1871, the King of Prussia was proclaimed Kaiser, Emperor, of a united German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. A powerful, industrializing nation in the heart of Europe was born. The Franco-Prussian War's outcome also left France bitter. They lost Alsace-Lorraine to Germany, sowing seeds for future conflict. Nationalism also affected the Austrian Empire, which in 1867 became the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary to appease Hungarian nationalism, giving Hungary equal status with Austria internally. In the Balkans, nationalist movements among Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians, and others gradually chipped away at Ottoman control. Notably, Greece had already won independence in the 1820s, with European great power help from the Ottomans, inspired by classical heritage and Orthodox identity. By late 19th century, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria were also emerging as independent or autonomous states from Ottoman rule, often with Russian support, as Russia styled itself the protector of Slavs and Orthodox Christians. With new nation-states formed, Europe's great power dynamics shifted. By the late 19th century, the major powers were Britain, with a vast overseas empire and naval supremacy, France, recovering from 1870 defeat, retaining a colonial empire in Africa/Asia, Germany, now a unified industrial powerhouse, rivaling Britain in industry and science, Austria-Hungary, a multi-ethnic empire struggling to maintain cohesion, Russia huge and populous, but still largely agrarian and autocratic, with some industrial spurts, and Italy unified but relatively weaker. Economically, this period is sometimes called the Belle Époque, especially 1871 to 1914, a time of relative peace between the great powers, rapid scientific progress, electricity, telephone, automobiles by the 1880s to 1900s, and flourishing arts, impressionism, etc. However, under the surface, rivalries and alliances were forming that would eventually lead to the Great War. The late 19th century is also notable for the climax of European imperialism. While Europe had long had colonies, now even countries that had few or lost them jump into the fray, and Africa and Asia were carved up at an unprecedented pace. The scramble for Africa in the 1880s, 1890s saw virtually the entire African continent, except independent Ethiopia and Liberia, divided among European powers. The British Empire spanned from Canada to India to Australia to large chunks of Africa, Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, etc., famously describing itself as the empire on which the sun never sets. France seized huge territories in West and Equatorial Africa and Indochina, Vietnam, etc. Belgium's King Leopold II notoriously exploited the Congo Free State as his personal domain with great brutality. Germany, a latecomer, took colonies in Africa, German East Africa, today's Tanzania, Namibia, Cameroon, etc., and the Pacific. Italy took parts of East Africa, Eritrea, Somalia, and tried, but initially failed, to conquer Ethiopia. Even Russia was expanding, not overseas, but by pushing its empire across Central Asia to the borders of Afghanistan and into the Caucasus and east of the Pacific, solidifying control over Siberia. This Russian expansion and British moves in Asia led to rivalry in Central Asia dubbed the Great Game. The era's imperial competition brought the powers to diplomatic clashes, e.g., the Berlin Conference of 1884–85 set some ground rules for African colonization to avoid European war over colonies. It also entangled Europe in global conflicts. For instance, the Crimean War, 1853–1856, saw Britain, France, and Ottomans fight Russia to check its expansion toward the Mediterranean. The Russo-Turkish War, 1877–78, over Balkans' freedom, the Opium Wars and Boxer Rebellion in China involving Western powers, the colonial wars like Britain's Boer War in South Africa, 1899–1902, all were signs of how European rivalries played out worldwide. By 1900, Europe best rode the world, militarily and economically. European nations controlled vast swathes of Africa and Asia, and European settler colonies like the United States, Canada, Australia, and others, by then independent or semi-independent, extended European-derived influence. Europe's population had grown significantly, aided by better medicine and nutrition. Its cities buzzed with modern life, electricity, streetcars, telegraphs. Cultural life was rich with modernism, stirring in arts and literature. However, tensions in Europe were also rising. Nationalist fervor made multi-ethnic empires like Austria-Hungary fragile, and the alliance system divided Europe largely into two armed camps by the early 20th century: the Triple Entente, Britain, France, Russia, versus the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy. The stage was set for a conflict that many thought impossible in this civilized age, but which would surpass any war before in scale and carnage. In the summer of 1914, Europe's long-building tensions exploded into the First World War, known then as the Great War. The immediate spark was the assassination of Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. Austria-Hungary's subsequent ultimatum to Serbia led to a cascade of mobilizations due to the interlocking alliance commitments. By early August 1914, Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, later joined by the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, were at war with the Allied powers, initially Serbia, Russia, France, Belgium, and Britain. Italy switched to join Allies in 1915, and many others, including the United States, eventually joined on the Allied side. World War I was unlike any prior conflict. It was industrialized. Total war. The Germans executed the Schlieffen Plan, invading Belgium and northeastern France in hopes of a quick victory, but were stopped at the Marne, 1914. The Western Front then bogged down into trench warfare, a brutal stalemate with muddy trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Soldiers faced machine guns, barbed wire, artillery barrages, poison gas attacks, technologies that made offensive charges extraordinarily deadly. Battles like Verdun and the Somme in 1916 each inflicted over 1 million casualties without decisive gains. On the Eastern Front, Germany and Austria-Hungary fought Russia, initially with more movement. Russia suffered massive losses and by 1917 was collapsing internally. Indeed, one consequence of World War I was the Russian Revolution of 1917. War weariness and poverty triggered the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II in March 1917, and later the Bolshevik communist coup in November 1917 led by Vladimir Lenin, who promised peace, land, and bread. Russia exited the war by signing the harsh Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in early 1918, surrendering large territories. Meanwhile, Germany turned its full attention to the Western Front. But the entry of the United States in 1917, provoked by German unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram, gave the Allies fresh manpower and resources. In 1918, after a final German spring offensive failed and Allied counteroffensives gained ground, the Central Powers crumbled one by one. World War I ended on November 11, 1918, with an armistice. The war's cost was staggering. Approximately 7 million soldiers were killed, and about 8 million civilians died from causes like starvation, disease, or military action. Empires fell. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated into new nation-states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, etc. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, leading to modern Turkey and European mandates in the Middle East. The German Empire was forced to become a republic, Weimar Republic, and the Russian Empire had already become the Soviet Union under the Bolsheviks. The map of Europe was redrawn. Poland was reborn as an independent nation after over a century of partition. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, gained independence from Russia, Finland too. The Allies, minus the US, which retreated into isolation, met at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 to shape the post-war order. The resulting Treaty of Versailles with Germany imposed heavy reparations, military limitations, and the loss of territory. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France, parts of Prussia to the new Poland, etc. Crucially, it assigned Germany sole blame for the war, a point that caused deep resentment in Germany. The League of Nations was also formed, an international body aimed at preventing future wars, though it proved ineffective partly because key nations like the US never joined and it lacked enforcement power. Europe was left physically and emotionally scarred by World War I, a lost generation mourned the millions dead, and the old certainties of pre-war society were shaken. In many countries, especially Germany and Italy, the post-war period was marked by economic crisis, hyperinflation in Germany 1923, global Great Depression starting 1929, political instability, and a search for new solutions. Unfortunately, this paved the way for extremist ideologies to take root. The 2 decades between the world wars were anything but peaceful for Europe. Political extremism rose as people grew disillusioned with liberal governments amid economic turmoil. In Italy, in 1922, Benito Mussolini and his fascist party marched on Rome and established the first fascist dictatorship, characterized by aggressive nationalism, militarism, and one-party rule. Fascism promoted the idea of a strong, authoritarian state as a bulwark against communism and chaos. Italy under Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935, seeking a colonial empire, and allied later with Nazi Germany. In Germany, the fragile Weimar Republic struggled with reparations, depression, and political violence. In 1933, Adolf Hitler, leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party, was appointed chancellor and swiftly consolidated power into a totalitarian regime. Hitler's Nazi ideology was an extreme form of fascism infused with racism and anti-Semitism, obsessed with Aryan racial purity and anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. Once in power, Hitler outlawed opposition, took control of the economy, and began massive military rearmament, defying the Versailles Treaty. His regime also systematically persecuted Jews, implementing ever harsher measures that would culminate in the Holocaust during World War II. Germany's expansionism became evident as Hitler aimed to overturn the post-World War I order. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland. In 1938, he annexed Austria, the Anschluss, and then demanded Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland. Britain and France, desperate to avoid another war, followed a policy of appeasement, conceding Sudetenland to Germany at the Munich Conference in 1938. Famously, Britain's PM Chamberlain declared peace for our time, a misjudgment soon clear. But appeasement failed. By March 1939, Hitler had occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia and had eyes on Poland. Meanwhile, Stalin had come to power in the Soviet Union after Lenin, establishing his own brutal dictatorship and pushing rapid industrialization at horrific human cost. Forced collectivization, famine, purges. The USSR was mistrusted by the West, but as Hitler grew aggressive, some hoped the Soviets might counterbalance him. In August 1939, however, Hitler and Stalin struck a cynical deal, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty in which they secretly agreed to divide Eastern Europe, Poland, Baltic states, etc., between them. On September 1, 1939, World War II began with Germany's invasion of Poland. Britain and France, having guaranteed Poland's borders, declared war on Germany. Poland was quickly overrun, partitioned between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Soviets also invaded Finland and annexed the Baltics in 1940 as per pact. The war went poorly for the Allies initially. In spring 1940, Germany conquered Denmark and Norway, then launched a blitzkrieg lightning war in the West, swiftly defeating the Netherlands, Belgium, and humiliatingly France, which fell in June 1940. Britain, under Winston Churchill's leadership, stood alone but defiant, enduring the Blitz bombing campaign by the German Luftwaffe in late 1940. In 1941, Hitler turned on his erstwhile partner and launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, initiating a war of annihilation in the East marked by extreme brutality and massive scale. By winter 1941, German forces besieged Leningrad and reached the gates of Moscow. Also in 1941, the war became truly global when Japan, Germany's ally, attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States fully into World War II on the Allied side. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history, with an estimated total of 70 to 85 million deaths globally. In Europe, the war reached an unprecedented level of barbarity. The Nazis implemented the Holocaust, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews, along with millions of other victims including Roma, Gypsies, disabled people, Poles and other Slavs, homosexuals, political dissidents, and POWs. Jews from all over occupied Europe were herded into ghettos and later transported to extermination camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, etc., in a state-organized effort to murder an entire people. This remains one of the darkest chapters of European history. On the battlefront, by late 1942, the tide began to turn. In the east, the Soviet Red Army held out in the brutal Battle of Stalingrad and then encircled and forced the surrender of an entire German army in early 1943, a decisive blow. After Stalingrad and the tank battle of Kursk, July 1943, the Soviets were on the offensive, slowly pushing westward, liberating their territory, and then Eastern Europe at an enormous cost. The USSR lost around 27 million people in World War II. In the Mediterranean, the Allies landed in North Africa in 1942, defeating Axis forces there, then invaded Italy in 1943. Italy's government overthrew Mussolini and switched sides, but the Germans occupied much of Italy and fierce fighting continued up the peninsula. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Western Allied forces, primarily the US, UK, Canada, launched the Normandy invasion in France, establishing a crucial front in Western Europe. By August 1944, Paris was liberated. The Allies advanced into Belgium and Western Germany, while the Soviets advanced from the east. Germany made a last-ditch counterattack in the west, the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, but failed. By spring 1945, Allied armies converged into the heart of Germany. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin on April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops captured the city street by street. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, ending World War II in Europe. The war against Japan would end in August 1945 after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the US, by which time the Soviet Union had also joined the war against Japan. Europe was left devastated by World War II. Entire cities lay in ruins from bombing and shelling: Warsaw, Berlin, Leningrad, London, Dresden, to name a few. Civilians had suffered horribly. Beyond the Holocaust, tens of millions were displaced, and starvation and disease followed in the war's wake. The war also fundamentally altered the geopolitical order. Old great powers like Britain and France emerged victorious, but economically and psychologically weakened. In their stead, two superpowers towered over the continent: the United States, whose homeland was mostly unscathed and economy booming, and the Soviet Union, victorious but at a staggering cost. Their alliance of convenience during the war quickly frayed, as ideological differences, capitalist democracy versus communist single-party state, and competition for influence hardened into a new conflict, the Cold War. After World War II, Europe found itself divided and largely dependent on the two new superpowers. The Iron Curtain, a term popularized by Churchill, fell across the continent, symbolically and literally in some places, separating the communist East from the capitalist West. The Cold War era, approximately 1947 to 1989, defined European politics as the continent became the central front of a global ideological and geopolitical struggle between the Western Bloc, led by the USA, and the Eastern Bloc, led by the USSR. In the immediate post-war years, Europe faced the massive task of reconstruction. The Western European economies were in shambles. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt and economies jump-started. The United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, a program of enormous financial aid to help rebuild Western European economies and prevent the spread of communism. Countries like France, West Germany, Italy, and the Benelux benefited greatly from Marshall Plan funds, fueling an economic recovery and an era of growth in the 1950s-60s, often called the economic miracle, especially the Wirtschaftswunder in West Germany. Eastern Europe, under Soviet influence, declined Marshall Plan aid and instead was reorganized along Soviet lines, with state-controlled economies and one-party regimes. Germany, the epicenter of both world wars, was partitioned. Its eastern part became the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, under Soviet-Allied communist rule, while the western zones controlled by the US, UK, and France merged into the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, in 1949, a democratic state aligned with the West. The city of Berlin, deep in the east, was itself divided into east and west sectors, culminating in the Soviets building the Berlin Wall in 1961 to stop East Germans from fleeing to the west. This wall became the stark symbol of the Iron Curtain division. Two military alliances formed. In 1949, the US, Canada, and Western European nations created NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a mutual defense pact aimed at deterring Soviet aggression. In 1955, The Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe responded with the Warsaw Pact, formalizing the Eastern Bloc's military alliance. Europe was now firmly split into two armed camps. A confrontation loomed in episodes like the Berlin Blockade, 1948-49, where the USSR tried to cut off Allied West Berlin, met by the Western Allies' successful Berlin airlift, and later the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, which, though in the Caribbean, brought the superpowers to the brink of nuclear war with immediate consequences for European security. Throughout, Europe lived under the nuclear shadow. Both the US and USSR stationed nuclear missiles, for instance, US missiles in Europe, Soviet missiles targeting Europe, making the continent a potential nuclear battlefield. This threat of mutual destruction paradoxically prevented direct superpower war, a tense balance of terror. While Eastern Europe fell under communist dictatorships, often enforced by the presence of Soviet troops, there were periodic rebellions. In Hungary in 1956, a reformist government tried to leave the Warsaw Pact and democratize. It was crushed by a Soviet military invasion. In Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Prague Spring reforms led by Alexander Dubček aimed for socialism with a human face, but Warsaw Pact tanks rolled in to suppress this experiment. Such events reinforced the Brezhnev Doctrine, whereby the USSR claimed the right to intervene if socialism was threatened in its bloc. Thus, Eastern Europeans lived in a repressive system with limited freedom, secret police, censorship, and constrained economies, although some stability and industrialization did occur under those regimes, and living standards varied. Some places like East Germany had relatively higher standards within the East Bloc. In stark contrast, Western Europe evolved toward greater unity and prosperity. Having learned the hard lessons of nationalism and war, Western European nations took steps to bind themselves economically and politically to prevent future conflict. In 1951, 6 nations, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, formed the European Coal and Steel Community, pooling these key industries. This was followed in 1957 by the Treaties of Rome, establishing the European Economic Community (EC), aiming for a common market without internal tariffs, and Euratom for nuclear cooperation. Over the decades, this integration deepened and expanded. The EC grew to include the UK, Ireland, Denmark, 1973, Greece, 1981, Spain, and Portugal, 1986, bringing former dictatorships Greece, Spain, Portugal into the democratic fold of Europe after they shed their authoritarian regimes in the 1970s. By 1992, the EC would evolve into the European Union (EU) with the Maastricht Treaty, but even by the late Cold War, the European Community, as it was often called, had fostered unprecedented cooperation. Political integration lagged behind economic, but there was significant headway, common policies on trade, agriculture, and eventually steps toward monetary union. The idea of Europeans solving problems through negotiation in Brussels rather than on battlefields was a remarkable historical turnaround. Western Europe also experienced an extended economic boom, especially from 1948 to the early 1970s. Often called the Trente Glorieuses, 30 glorious years in France, this era saw rising living standards, cars, televisions, new appliances became common. Social welfare systems, the welfare state, expanded, providing healthcare, pensions, and education underpinning social stability. The UK, France, West Germany, and others rebuilt their industries and became wealthy consumer societies. However, challenges emerged in the 1970s. The oil crises, 1973, 1979, ended the high-growth era and led to inflation and unemployment stagflation. Nonetheless, by the 1980s, Western Europe was still generally affluent, though struggling with industrial decline in some regions and the need for economic reforms. Culturally, Western Europe enjoyed vibrant democratic life. Student and worker protests in 1968, notably in Paris, also in Italy, West Germany, etc., challenged old social norms and prompted cultural liberalization. The late 20th century saw significant social changes. The role of women transformed, with more in the workforce and feminist movements pushing for equality. Immigration, especially from former colonies or Southern Europe, changed the demographic makeup, and tensions sometimes flared over integration of immigrants. Post-World War II, decolonization dramatically reduced Europe's direct control over the world. Were weakened and facing colonial independence movements, often with US or Soviet moral support, European powers gave up their colonies. British India gained independence and partitioned into India and Pakistan in 1947. The Dutch East Indies became Indonesia after a struggle, 1949. The 1950s and 60s saw nearly all of Africa freed. Britain and France withdrew from dozens of African colonies, some peaceably, some after conflict like France's brutal war in Algeria, 1954-62. The Portuguese clung on until mid-1970s, when regime change at home prompted release of Angola, Mozambique, etc. Thus, by 1975, Europe's once sprawling colonial empires were mostly gone, with only small remnants, some island territories, etc. While ending colonial rule was morally and politically necessary, it did diminish Europe's global standing in some respects. Superpowers USA and USSR dominated global affairs, and many newly independent nations joined a non-aligned movement to avoid siding with either in the Cold War. However, Western Europe found a new collective role. It aligned firmly with the US in the Cold War, forming the backbone of NATO. American troops stationed in Europe, especially West Germany, helped deter Soviet aggression, while European countries provided bases and support. Europeans benefited from the US nuclear umbrella, though movements like the 1980s anti-nuclear protests showed public fears of being on the front line of a nuclear confrontation. By the 1980s, the Soviet bloc was increasingly strained. The planned economies of Eastern Europe lagged in innovation and consumer goods. People were discontent, e.g., the solidarity movement of workers in Poland in the early 1980s challenged the communist regime. The Soviet Union itself faced economic stagnation and an unwinnable war in Afghanistan. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet leader and introduced reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, to liberalize the system. But these reforms inadvertently unleashed forces that would break the Soviet hold on Eastern Europe. In 1989, a remarkable series of mostly peaceful revolutions swept through Eastern Europe. It began in Poland, where semi-free elections led to a solidarity-led government. Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating a breach in the Iron Curtain. East Germans started fleeing via Hungary, and mass protests filled East German streets. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, a stunning moment as East Germany opened the border and jubilant citizens from East and West tore down the wall, symbolizing the Cold War's end. Communist governments tumbled in Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution, Bulgaria, Romania, where the change was violent and the dictator Ceausescu was executed, and others. By 1990, Germany reunified as East Germany joined the Federal Republic. The Soviet Union itself unraveled in 1991. Republics like the Baltics declared independence. A hardliners' coup against Gorbachev failed. And by December 1991, the USSR was dissolved into independent states, with Russia being the largest. The Cold War was effectively over. Eastern European countries swiftly moved to shed communism, implement democratic elections, and transition to market economies, a difficult road that led to hardship for many initially. NATO and the European community would soon expand eastward to include many of these former Eastern Bloc nations. The end of the Cold War meant Europe was no longer divided by ideology. The vision of a whole and free Europe emerged, though it came with new challenges of integrating very different economic systems and dealing with nationalist tensions previously suppressed under communist rule. One dark side of the immediate post-Cold War era was the Yugoslav Wars in the 1990s. The multi-ethnic federation of Yugoslavia broke apart into new countries, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, etc., and violent ethnic conflicts, especially in Bosnia 1992-95 and later Kosovo 1998-99, erupted. Europe witnessed atrocities and ethnic cleansing reminiscent of World War II. Eventually, NATO intervened militarily in Bosnia and Kosovo to halt the violence. The Yugoslav Wars were the worst conflict in Europe since 1945, reminding that nationalism could still spark war on the continent even after the Cold War. Nonetheless, by 1991, Europe was broadly transitioning into a new era. Post-Cold War Europe promised greater unity, with the European community expanding and deepening into the European Union, and former communist countries seeking to join Western institutions. The ideological battle was largely resolved in favor of liberal democracy and capitalism, at least for the time being, and Europeans hoped to focus on peace, prosperity, and integration. Entering the new millennium, Europe had largely achieved a few generations' dream, a continent mostly at peace and politically united to an extent unimaginable earlier. The European Union formally came into being in 1993, and it introduced the euro currency in 1999, coins and notes in circulation from 2002. For many member states, further integrating their economies. NATO, despite its original adversary vanishing, reinvented itself and even expanded, adding many Central and Eastern European countries in the late 1990s and 2000s, a move Russia viewed warily. The 21st century Europe, however, has faced its own set of challenges and transformations, indicating that history is always in the making. The EU grew from 15 members in the 1990s to 28 by the 2010s, with expansions in 2004, 2007, 2013 bringing in much of Eastern Europe. This eastward expansion symbolized healing of Cold War divisions. The EU became not just an economic union but increasingly a political one, with its own parliament, courts, and a degree of pooled sovereignty. Citizens of EU countries gained rights to travel, study, and work freely across national borders. The Schengen Agreement abolished many internal borders. The euro currency was adopted by 19 of the member states, creating a powerful economic bloc. However, integration also brought debates over sovereignty. Not all countries moved at the same pace. For example, the UK and some others stayed out of the euro and Schengen. In 2005, proposed EU constitution was rejected in referendums in France and the Netherlands, reflecting some public skepticism. The treaty was reformulated as the Lisbon Treaty, effective 2009, giving the EU a legal personality and streamlined institutions. While the EU delivered stability and prosperity for many, criticism grew that it was bureaucratic and distant from ordinary citizens. Tensions between national interests and collective decisions sometimes caused friction. In the late 2000s, Europe was hit by the Great Recession and Eurozone debt crisis. The 2008 global financial crisis led to recessions across Europe. It exposed weaknesses in the Eurozone. Countries like Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain found themselves with severe debt and, lacking independent currencies, required bailouts coordinated by the EU and IMF. Austerity measures sparked protests and political upheaval in some countries, notably Greece. Despite fears of Eurozone breakup, the EU held together, albeit with lingering economic imbalances between a richer North, Germany, etc., and a struggling South. Unemployment spiked in some areas, and youth unemployment in southern Europe stayed very high for years. Nevertheless, by late 2010s, many economies recovered to an extent. Germany, now Europe's largest economy, often drove the recovery, but the crises led to questions about how closely integrated fiscal and political union should be to support a common currency. Parallel to economic issues, Europe experienced rising populist and nationalist movements, partly a reaction to globalization, EU enlargement, and immigration. Concerns over loss of national identity terrorism, after a series of jihadist terrorist attacks in European cities in the 2000 and 2010s, and economic inequalities fueled far-right and anti-establishment parties. In some countries, these parties gained significant influence, e.g., National Rally in France, Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, Law and Justice in Poland, Fidesz in Hungary. Some Eastern European governments took a liberal turns, clashing with EU principles on rule of law and media freedom. One major political event was Brexit, the United Kingdom's vote in 2016 to leave the EU, driven by a campaign emphasizing sovereignty and concerns over immigration. This was a historic reversal for EU integration. After complex negotiations, the UK formally exited the EU in January 2020. Brexit underscored that not all Europeans saw the Union as beneficial, and it introduced economic and political uncertainty, especially for the UK itself. Europe in the 21st century also faced significant migration flows. The European migrant crisis of 2015 to 2016 saw over 1 million refugees and migrants fleeing war in Syria, instability in the Middle East, poverty in Africa, arrive in Europe. This surge strained the EU's border control and asylum systems and sparked disagreements among member states about burden sharing. Countries like Germany took in large numbers. Chancellor Merkel famously said, "We're schaffen das, we can manage it," whereas some Central European states resisted EU migrant quotas. The crisis fueled anti-immigrant sentiment and became a flashpoint in internal EU politics. Longer term, Europe's population is aging, and in some countries shrinking without immigration. Debates over integrating immigrants, particularly Muslims, into predominantly secular or Christian origin societies have been significant, e.g., discussions on multiculturalism, religious dress, etc. Nonetheless, Europe remains a destination for many seeking better lives, and its cities grow ever more cosmopolitan. Post-Cold War, Russia initially was weakened but later reasserted itself under Vladimir Putin in power since 2000. Tensions between Russia and the West resurfaced, particularly as NATO/EU expanded into former Eastern Bloc. Russia viewed this as encroachment. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine and supported separatists in eastern Ukraine, alarming Europe and triggering EU/US sanctions on Russia. This was the first forcible change of European borders since World War II and revived fears of aggression. Eastern European states, especially the Baltic countries and Poland, grew anxious and NATO increased its presence in those areas. These tensions boiled over when, in February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the largest war in Europe since 1945. This Russian invasion of Ukraine aimed to overthrow Ukraine's government and reassert Russian influence. The war has had profound effects on Europe. It shattered the post-1991 notion that large-scale war was unthinkable on the continent, led to massive Ukrainian refugee flows into Europe, prompted the EU to show rare unity in imposing heavy sanctions on Russia, and even pushed traditionally neutral countries like Sweden and Finland to seek NATO membership. It also caused energy and food supply shocks, since Europe was reliant on Russian gas and Ukraine/Russia are major grain exporters. The conflict is ongoing as of mid-2025, with Ukraine fiercely resisting and receiving substantial support from European nations and the US, but it has returned war to European soil, testing the resolve and unity of Europe. Despite challenges, Europe in the 21st century remains a place of remarkable achievements. The long peace, no major wars between European powers since 1945, is a historical triumph. Europeans enjoy generally high standards of living, robust social welfare, and respect for human rights. The European Convention on Human Rights and institutions like the European Court of Human Rights help uphold these. The continent remains a leader in fields like science, technology, and culture. European cities are hubs of art, academia, and innovation. The EU, for all its difficulties, has provided an unprecedented framework for cooperation and conflict resolution among former rivals. Yet Europe's story continues, with new chapters being written. Issues like climate change. Europe has been at the forefront of climate initiatives like the Paris Agreement 2015, energy transition, balancing relations with emerging global powers, China, etc., and preserving democracy in the face of internal and external threats are all pressing. The demographic shift, aging populations, and economic competition will test Europe's adaptability. As of now, Europe finds itself navigating through aftermaths of crises, recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic that struck in 2020, with heavy death tolls in Italy, UK, etc., testing European solidarity initially but later seeing cooperative vaccine rollouts, addressing the consequences of the Great Recession, managing Brexit's fallout, and responding to Russia's military aggression. Europe's history of resilience offers hope time and again. The continent has rebuilt and reinvented itself after dark periods. From the ashes of Rome arose medieval Europe. From the Black Death came renewal and Renaissance. From the world wars emerged a resolve for unity and peace. The current European Union itself is a testament. What began as a coal and steel pact to prevent war evolved into a union that, despite imperfections, has bound countries together so tightly that war between them is nearly inconceivable. In conclusion, the entire history of Europe is an immense tapestry of peoples, cultures, conflicts, and ideas. Europe gave the world classical civilization, Christianity, the Renaissance, the scientific and industrial revolutions, and ideals of democracy and human rights, but also experienced devastating plagues, religious strife, colonialism, and the horrors of 2 world wars and genocide. Each era left layers that still shape Europe's identity today. Standing in the present, Europeans carry forward the lessons of this long history, cherishing peace, striving for cooperation, and remaining vigilant that the mistakes of the past not be repeated. Europe's story is ongoing, a dynamic narrative that continues to evolve, and listening to its entire history gives us not only knowledge of the past, but insight into the challenges and triumphs that have made Europe what it is and what it yet may become.